Okay. Let's just wait one more minute for attendees to join. Okay, people are coming in. We will start in 30 seconds or so. Good. Welcome everybody to our second webinar. I hope you enjoyed our first one on bias in AI and data. If you missed it, you can always rewatch the recording on YouTube or on our website. Also, this webinar will be recorded and distributed afterwards. Today we have a very special guest. His name is Lode Lauwaert. Lode is professor at KU Leuven, University in Belgium, and he teaches philosophy of technology. He studied psychology and philosophy and was a visiting researcher at the universities of Vienna, Stellenbosch, and Boston. His research and teaching focuses on technology from the point of view of ethics, cultural philosophy, and philosophical anthropology. He recently published a book called We Robots, and this book is about AI, ethics, and moral responsibility. And today he will go in depth into this topic. With We Robots, he has been nominated recently for the Socrates Cup for the most urgent, original, and stimulating Dutch language philosophy book. And if that isn't enough, Lode is currently also working on turning his book into a documentary. Stay tuned also until the end of the webinar because we give away 3 free books of We Robots. So Lode, the floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon. Thanks, Matthias, for the introduction, also for inviting me. Before we start, let me first share my screen. Okay, you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Where's my screen? Here is it. Okay, before we start, is there? I'll talk in English, but is maybe if everybody's able to understand Dutch, then I could talk in Dutch. Let's have a look in the chat, maybe. Let's have a look. Is there someone who is not able to understand Dutch? Okay, then I'll talk. Okay, no problem. I'll talk in English. Okay. I have to move to the share the screen. Okay, there we are. Current slide. Okay. So good morning, everyone. Well, it's already noon. Welcome to this this webinar. What I'll suggest is I'll talk about for about 30-40 minutes about ethics and AI, which is also the title of the at least the subdomain in which I'm working and also in which the presentation and webinar will be situated. And I'll talk about ethics and AI for about 35 minutes, 40 minutes maximum, and then we have 20 minutes left for discussion and for questions. Before I start, my name is Lode. I'm working at the Institute of Philosophy in Leuven. And if you have any kind of questions regarding ethics and AI, regarding this lecture, regarding my book, you can always send an email to my email address, lode.lauwaert@kuleuven.be. As much as just said, I recently published a book, Where Robots. It's a Dutch book, but I'm translating the book into English. And if everything's going well, normally within 1 year it should be published by MIT Press in English. als Wij Robots, een filosofische blik op technologie en artificiële intelligentie. If you are able to understand Dutch and you would like to have a copy of it, you can always send me an email, yeah, then I can send it to you if you would be interested in reading this book. So what I'm doing at the University of Leuven, I'm doing at least two things. First one is that I'm teaching a lot of courses for most of the time engineering students, ethics of technology, ethics of AI specifically, and also doing research. The last couple of 2, 3, 4 years, I did research on ethics of AI, and I summarized that research in this book. I'll talk about it within a minute. My current research, I touched upon it a little bit in the book for a couple of pages, but my current research will be presented in a new book on social media and polarization, about the causal link between those two phenomena. I'll talk about it within a minute. The book is divided into 3 chapters, and 3 chapters, and all of them start or are organized around one very deep-rooted and very old conviction thesis. The first chapter is about the thesis that technology is something that is neutral. The second one is that AI is something that is disruptive. And the last chapter, the third chapter, is about another thesis, which is about the relation between science and between technology in general and society. The often defended idea is, or thesis is, that technology determines a society. My question is that correct? So what I do in every chapter is I focus on one of those 3 theses, and I do mostly 2 things. First, I try to clarify the meaning of that sentence, the meaning of that thesis. It's very interesting, and it seems to be very intelligent to defend the idea that AI is something that is disruptive, but that it should be, at the same time, it should be very clear what the thesis means, in the sense that it is often not 100% crystal clear what is the specific meaning, interpretation of that thesis. So I don't think that a lot of philosophers can do a lot of things, but they can do at least one thing, is that they can try to clarify the meanings of concepts and theses. That's one thing that is central in every chapter. I try to conceptually clarify the meaning of notions, concepts, and theses. The second thing that I do is that I take a more evaluative perspective. The first one is more descriptive. The second one is more normative, in the sense that I'll try to make an evaluation of the arguments that are often given in order to defend that thesis. And there is like W's argument that is often given to defend the thesis that technology is neutral. Now, my question is, does that argument do the work that it needs to do? Does it support sufficiently that thesis? And also, if it doesn't work, if it doesn't do the work sufficiently that it needs to do, can we give other arguments that go against that thesis? What are the arguments pro and what are the arguments contra that thesis? And I'll focus next couple of 30 minutes, I'll focus on the second thesis, on the thesis that AI is something that is disruptive at the ethical moral level. But let me say a couple of words, a couple of things about the first chapter, the first thesis, and the third one. So the idea that technology is neutral, should not be understood at the level of the use of technology. Of course, we can do a lot of positive, we can do a lot of negative things when using technology. We can use military technology, for example, in order to defend the country, but also to attack a country, for example, to use a current example. But that's the thesis, the neutrality thesis is not about the use of technology, it's about the technology itself. Yeah. So the idea is that as detached from its use, the artifact is neutral. Well, yeah, as I told you, my first concern is, well, what does this thesis mean? And you can distinguish a broad and a very small interpretation of that thesis. And the broad interpretation is that technology seen as such, conceived as such, outside its use, can be detached from a lot of things. And for that reason, it is a broad interpretation. It can be detached from, or it can be understood as detached from values, norms, perspectives, ideologies, stereotypes. And the small interpretation is about, well, technology is something that is morally neutral in the sense that it is, as such, it is detached from any kind of moral value. And the moral value is important. Why? Well, we have a lot of morally neutral values. Efficiency and accuracy, for example, are values, or beauty also. Beauty, accuracy, and efficiency are values that are important for an architect, for example, for an engineer or computer scientists. But these three values don't have a moral character. So the neutrality thesis, about the neutral character, is about the morally neutral character of technology, about the fact that it should be understood as detached from moral values such as sustainability, privacy, autonomy, fairness, equity, etc. Well, I think that some technologies, and I call them the primitive, between brackets, the primitive technologies can be understood as neutral. A hammer, for example, or a knife maybe, or even a computer can be seen as neutral in the sense that they can be sufficiently described as without any kind of reference to a moral norm, value, perspective, ideology, or stereotype. Yeah? That would be my answer. So some technologies are indeed neutral, but, and that's my point, a lot of technologies, or at least a lot of examples that I can give, a lot of technologies are not neutral, neither in the broad, neither in the narrow sense, in the small sense. Let me give you, let's say, two examples. The first example is about stupid technology, in the sense that the technology, the artifact, is not equipped with AI, with artificial intelligence. Well, a lot of cars are made with the average length of a male human being, and not with the average length of and weight of an average female human being. So you could say that the average car is made from a very specific masculine perspective, and thus not neutral. Of course, that doesn't mean that the engineer, that the developer, the maker, the producer or the designer of that technology, of that car, is sexist. Of course not. And he or she doesn't need to have very sexist assumptions or worldviews. No, but at the same time, you cannot say anymore that the technology is neutral. There is some masculine perspective that cannot be detached, or that the car cannot be detached from a masculine perspective, since that car is made with the average length and weight of a male human being in mind. It doesn't imply that the developer is sexist, but at the same time, it is not innocent, in the sense that the fact that the average car is made with the average length and weight of a human being, or male human being, in mind, has as its consequence that female human beings do have a higher risk of being involved in a deadly accident, car accident. And they also have a higher risk of being the victim of a whiplash, of having a whiplash, for example. So that's not totally innocent anymore. Another example of a technology, but here a smart technology, that is, in my opinion, a reason to believe that technology is not necessarily neutral, is that some technologies, some smart technologies, some technologies that are equipped with AI, do work only for white human beings, and don't work sufficiently for non-white Afro-American human beings. Yeah, we have the example of ImageNet, for example. Well, a lot of facial recognition is developed with the help of data. In this case, data pictures that are that you can find in a data bank called ImageNet, and a lot of pictures that belong to that data bank are pictures and photos from a specific part of the global world population, namely male, often male, but more specifically white human beings. And that means that the facial recognition system learns to recognize the human beings that do have a white skin, and it doesn't work sufficiently for non-white Afro-American human beings. And of course, again, it doesn't mean that the facial recognition is made by a racist human being, of course not, but it means that the system is biased and thus not neutral anymore. That would be a second example that I would like to present as an argument, at least in order to be critical of what I call the neutrality thesis, right? So I'm a little bit nuanced in the sense that I don't believe that all technologies are neutral, but I also don't believe that that's the other extreme, that all technologies are not neutral. I believe that somewhere in the middle between those two extremes, I do believe that some technologies are neutral, whereas some technologies aren't. That would be my point. If you would be interested in reading more about that, that's written down and summarized in the book Wij Robots, the first chapter called The Neutrality of Technology. Let me say a couple of words about the last one, and then I'll focus more and more specifically on AI on the second chapter. So the last third thesis is about determinism. It's about the relation between technology and society. And there the idea is that technology determines, influences, pushes our society, the social organization of the organization of our social relations and groups. That technology determines that relationship, these relationships, that social organization. And in the chapter, in the third chapter, I distinguish at least 4 interpretations of that kind of reasoning. But let me say a couple of things about one interpretation. And that focuses on that's also my current research on the relationship between social media and polarization. And that the idea is that social media polarizes society. It has a polarizing effect on our organization of our democracy. Of course, a lot of people do believe that thesis, and maybe they have some good reasons for it, or at least they have the impression that is a correct thesis. But if you would like to testify that thesis, I think it's the best way to test this is to look at scientific research. Of course, researchers, scientists can make mistakes, but it's the most defendable way to support your or the best way to support your claims. Well, 2 things about it. You can say a lot of things about it, but I'll say at least 2 things about it. First, if you believe that social media polarize society, that seems to suggest that you have a very good idea of what polarization is. Well, to be honest, if you look at the literature, academic literature or not, if you look at the literature, we can distinguish a lot of interpretations of polarization. To be honest, I can distinguish at least 13 or 14 interpretations, concepts of polarization. To give an idea, an often used meaning of the term polarization is that it refers to me as a human being, as a person, as an individual, becoming more and more extreme. First, at the first moment, I believe that gun ownership, for example, could be allowed, but in some cases it would be very difficult to defend that. That was my first idea. In some cases, it could be allowed, but not every time. Well, after a couple of years, and maybe under the influence of social media, I believed more and more that it could be allowed anytime. Yeah, that there should be no restriction. And thus my conviction about gun ownership is becoming more and more extreme. Yeah. So here polarization is understood as becoming more and more convinced, becoming more and more extreme. But the term could also be used at the more population level, meaning that the society or the society could be more and more divided into two groups of human beings. On the one hand, and look at the United States, for example, on the one hand, you have those liberals, more left-wing, progressive human beings, and on the other hand, you have more Republican, conservative, right-wing human beings. So the society is split into two groups, and there's more and more less people that are somewhere in the middle, and that wasn't the case in the 50s or the 60s of the last century. There, of course, at that time you also had, of course, two groups, but more people, at least more than now, more people were somewhere in the middle. Sometimes they had like a left-wing idea or conviction or thesis, but sometimes, for example, about migration, they had a more right-wing interpretation. And that has changed. More and more, our current society, according to some people, is divided into two groups without any kind of human being somewhere in the middle anymore. Yeah. So what is polarization? And the second point that I wanted to make is, if you look at the literature, the scientific literature, in order to support the thesis that social media polarizes society, you should be very careful when using that scientific research. Why? Well, scientists can make a lot of claims, but a lot of scientific research on that causal link between technology and social media and polarization is about correlational links between phenomena, meaning that they try to investigate and they try to defend that in a society where we use more and more social media, you can predict that there is some increase of polarization. There is a correlation between them, between those two phenomena. But that, of course, the correlational link between those two phenomena does not imply that there is also a causal link between those two things. Yeah, so correlation does not imply causation. That's the idea. To give another example, well, the first phenomena is that there is an increase of eating ice cream, and which is correlated to the phenomenon that there is a lot of more murders in the society. So once you see that there is an increase in consumption of ice cream, you can predict that we have also more and more murders in the society. So there is a correlation between those two things, but that of course doesn't imply that there is a causation. Seen, and it is very clear here. It's here the correlation is caused by a third thing, namely the increase of the temperature. The more it becomes warm, the more people consume ice cream, and the more they are involved in murders. So that's also the case for scientific research on social media and polarization. If you see that research saying that or defending the idea that there is a correlational link between those two phenomena, you may not defend your thesis about the causal link between those two phenomena based upon that research. Why? Because correlation doesn't imply causation. Well, let's now, and that's going to be my focus for the next part. The most important thing about the second thesis, that AI is disruptive. That's also about the second chapter of my book. So there, it's of course a very widespread conviction among philosophers, among scientists, about policymakers, also about technologists and the CEOs, is that AI has a disruptive effect on society. It doesn't have a disruptive effect, just like Uber, Airbnb, Tesla, 3D printing. It disrupts our society. And for example, you find in Thierry Geerts, who is the CEO of Google in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, And you find this in his book from 2018, Digitalis, the following. Well, he there writes that it is clear that the current digital revolution is radically changing our entire world and is turning everything upside down. Many people speak of disruption, and the technological revolution disrupts the old world and makes it fall apart. That's the idea. So that's the idea of a disruption. I think that there are at least reason to be, it's not an argument, but at least there's a reason to be skeptical. I think about the toothbrush from Oral-B. That is not the dumb technology, you see, the not smart technology, but it's an example of smart technology in the sense that the Oral-B toothbrush is equipped with artificial intelligence. And you can make use of it, and at some point you can receive a message on your app or your mobile phone saying that you have to brush a little bit more on the left corner on the right, or on the right, for example, because that AI system assesses that probably and maybe there's a high risk of a problem there on that part of your mouth. And then you start brushing a little bit more on the right corner, on the left corner, and yeah, somewhere in your mouth. Could be very helpful, could be very instrumental, it could be very desirable. It could be good to have this kind of technology, but would you say that this kind of technology does have a disruptive effect on society? Yeah, that's a reason to be skeptical, in other words. At the same time, you could say that we can think of a couple of examples that gives us reason to believe, at least, or to not throw away that thesis immediately, to not throw away that disruption thesis immediately. Two examples. It's very difficult and maybe even impossible to think about our current Western society, but society in general, about the entire global society, without the existence of a wheel or a printing press. How would our society look like without this wheel, without the printing press? It's very difficult to think that this wheel or this printing press didn't have a very disruptive, didn't have a very impactful effect on our society. A lot of people say that, or some people, at least historians, for example, say that the printing press did have a revolutionary, disruptive effect on Christianity, that it was the cause of the schism in Christianity between the Catholics on the one hand and the others, non-Catholics, but still Christians on the other, on the one hand. So there was some disruptive effect of the printing press. So due to the fact that the Bible could be printed, due to that fact, a lot of people, not only the priests, for example, but also we, non-priests, but still Christians, we were able to read that text and to interpret it ourselves. Yeah? And that was the reason, according to some people, that there was a schism in Christianity. Well, if stupid, dumb technology without artificial intelligence could have a revolutionary effect, why couldn't it be the case for an artificial system, an artificial intelligence system? I'm not going to focus on economical or military or political effects of artificial intelligence. I'm going to focus on ethics. Yeah, so the idea that AI is disruptive can be interpreted at many levels. And you could say that it is disruptive at the political level, that it has a disruptive effect on politics or military affairs. Of course, that's very interesting, but I'm not able to do that since I'm not an expert in politics or military affairs or economical thinking. I do know a little bit about moral philosophy, about ethics. And so I do know a little bit about that subdomain of philosophy, ethics. And there you could say that, well, AI is disruptive could mean that this could mean, it's not necessarily the only interpretation, but it could mean that AI does have a disruptive effect in the sense that it creates totally new moral problems. Yeah. there are, of course, moral problems that exist before the introduction of AI, but since we implemented AI, there are totally new moral problems that disrupt the current domain of moral philosophy and ethics. Well, if you would like to testify that idea, that thesis, I think it's desirable to focus on the issues, the moral, ethical concerns, issues that are often linked to AI systems. And I first think about misuse or abuse. I think also about of privacy, of course, bias, safety and security, about transparency, and also sustainability. Yeah. So you already had a webinar on bias. Bias is, of course, a moral issue, a moral concern that is immediately linked to the use of AI systems, but of course, it is a very known and important and difficult problem. But bias is not a new problem. Bias is a problem, is a moral issue, is a moral problem that already existed before the introduction of AI. We are all biased, even there is no, even if we don't use any kind of smart system. Yeah, just for example, the lookism problem, that people are biased in the sense that they focus or they tend to give higher weight to people that are physically attractive, compared with people that are less physically attractive. And that's an example of lookism, an example of being biased, even though there is no smart system that is used in that case. So bias cannot be an argument in order to defend the disruption thesis at ethical level. Same goes for sustainability. We all know that we can use AI systems in order to solve, at least partly, to help reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. But we at the same time know that the training and implementation of AI systems, the training of algorithms, asks in a lot of cases a lot of energy. And of course, an energy means that a lot of greenhouse gases are spread into the cosmos, you could say, in the air. That's a huge problem. That's a moral issue. It's a green moral issue. It's often a bit under the radar, and I think it's important to focus about it more and more. It's a very important problem. But at the same time, it's not a new problem. What I would say is that the issue of the green issue of sustainability is an issue that is linked to AI, but AI only, or the introduction and implementation of AI only intensifies that issue. It's an older problem that has been intensified by AI. So again, as with bias, but also privacy and transparency and safety and abuse and sustainability, also is not an argument in order to defend the disruption thesis. So I think that when we talk about AI at the ethical level, there are at least 6 sins, I would say. Yeah, sins that these systems face some moral issues, moral problems, but none of these issues is radically new. And that's my point for today. My point is that, yeah, maybe there is a 7th sin that can at the same time be an argument in order to defend the disruption thesis at the ethical level. As some people, and Robert Sparrow is an ethicist who defended that thesis, some people, and he did that in the context of military weapons, some people believe that the introduction and implementation of AI systems creates what they call a responsibility gap. And meaning that, well, if an AI system is used by the government, for example, or by an officer or by a CEO in a company, if it is used and it makes a mistake, it is impossible, or at least unjustified, to hold a human being responsible for that mistake. Yeah, that's what they call the responsibility gap. Maybe you are maybe you have the desire or the willingness at least to hold someone responsible, but it is unjustified to hold someone responsible. That's the idea. Whether or not it's correct, I'll explain that, or I'll answer that question immediately. But that, according to some people, would be the case. First, that there is we talk about the responsibility gap. There is a gap between your willingness to hold someone responsible and the justification of that moral practice. You cannot hold, or you may not hold it. It's unjustified. That's the gap. And some people believe that this is a moral problem. If you are not able to hold someone responsible for a mistake, that's a moral problem first, and that should be also something that is new. It didn't exist before the introduction of AI systems. So there are three things that we should keep in mind here. If you would like to use that responsibility gap phenomenon in order to support the disruption thesis, you should first explain and argue that AI systems indeed create a responsibility gap. Second, you should argue that this gap is a moral problem, and second, that this existence is something new. I'm not going to do the second and the third thing. I'm not going to defend or criticize the problematic idea of a responsibility gap or the novel character of it. I'm just going to focus on the possible existence of the responsibility gap. Do we face a responsibility gap if we use autonomous cars, for example? Autonomous cars, and do they create a gap? But before I explain that, so we talk about self-driving cars, autonomous cars, or about, for example, killer robots. These two technologies are examples of artificial technologies equipped with AI, and they do have an autonomous character in the sense that, well, once you push the button, of course they are made and produced by a human being, but once you decide to push the button, there's no human being anymore that is needed in order to work, to be efficient and effective. And second, it's not only that those systems follow the rules that has been inscribed by a human being into the system, and the system can itself decide between brackets what the best possible output is for the system. It's about killer robots, about self-driving cars, and here you see on the screen, you see a picture of the campaign against killer robots. There's a lot of discussion on the European, but also the global level, also the national level here in Belgium, about the existence and the justification or unjustified character of those killer robots. Between brackets, there is also a campaign against sex robots. So you could argue against or some people argue against the existence and the development of that kind of sex robot. And so the same question could be asked here. If for example, a sex robot would make a mistake, do something that is morally undesirable, something that we should see, that we normally see outside the use of those sex robots, that they do something, that they make a mistake, well, in that case, nobody can be held responsible. That's the idea. Well, in order to answer that question, it should be clear first what the autonomous character of the robot is, or the system is. But second, it should also be clear what responsibility is. And here I think the role of a philosopher is important. I mean, in what sense? Well, if you use the term responsibility, we can at least distinguish three interpretations of that notion. You could say that someone is responsible in a very causal sense, but also in a moral sense, and also in a more role responsibility sense. Only the second one is important. Moral responsibility or responsibility is here and in most cases used in a moral sense, meaning that, well, if you say that you are morally responsible for something or responsible for something, that you are the candidate for punishment or rewarding in case you believe that someone needs to be rewarded or punished. Yeah. Something negative happened, something very bad happened, and what happened was so bad that someone needs to be punished. Well, you are morally responsible for it. That means that you need to be punished. That's the moral interpretation of responsibility here that I use. You could also, I'm not going to explain it further, but you could also have a causal or a moral responsibility interpretation. And for example, you could use the term responsibility also to refer to duties that are linked to your function, to the role. That's the third one. So the responsibility gap is about the second one, about the moral responsibility. So the idea is, well, if a system, a killer robot, for example, kills an innocent human being, an innocent child, then it is unjustified to punish a human being for that negative outcome. Yeah, that is the idea. That is the description of the thesis. Well, whether or not that's justified to defend the thesis, it should be clear that what the conditions are for moral responsibility. What are the conditions that are normally should be met in order to hold someone morally responsible? And traditionally, we have three conditions that need to be met in order to hold someone morally responsible. The first one is that there should be a causal link. Yeah, if there is no link whatsoever between me as the responsible human being and the negative outcome, whether or not that link is direct or indirect, yeah, it would be unjustified to hold me responsible for it. If I don't have anything at all to do with the negative outcome, it would be very difficult or unjustified to punish me for that outcome. That's the first condition. There should be at least maybe a small, but at least some kind of link. Second, the negative outcome or the moral responsible human being should be an autonomous human being, in the sense that, well, I should have weighed the arguments in favor of a decision, and also the arguments that go against that decision. There should be some thinking about the arguments in favor and the contra arguments, and then based upon that, looking at the arguments, I should have made, only based upon my own reasoning, I should have made a decision. If I didn't do that, if I'm not able to reason in an autonomous way about the decision, there is no autonomy, and thus I cannot be held responsible for the decision or the outcome. For example, if I say to someone, you have to kill that human being, or if I kill a human being, yeah, but there is someone else who holds a gun on my head, and I don't have any autonomous possibility to do some moral reasoning and to support my decision to kill another being, well, there is no autonomy there, and thus I cannot be held responsible for the fact that I kill the human being. The person who holds the gun on my head should be seen as the moral responsible human being. And the last one is the knowledge condition. Well, you can only be held responsible for a negative or a positive outcome in case you were able to foresee the negative and the positive or the positive effects. If you were totally unable to see that or foresee that positive or negative outcome, it is unjustified to hold that human being morally responsible. I'm about to finish, but that was the traditional analysis of moral responsibility. So if you meet those three conditions, then you can hold someone responsible. Well, those defending the responsibility gap thesis believe that another fourth condition needs to be met, and they talk about control. So if you don't have any control over a decision or an action, you cannot be held responsible. So moral responsibility requires control. Control is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. And that's, of course, the case for example, take the killer robot. Of course, at a certain point, a human being pushes the button, but once you push the button, you don't have control anymore over the system. And thus, if that system makes a mistake, they believe that you cannot be held responsible anymore. Well, I do believe that our argumentation is problematic, in the sense that we can think at least about two practices, or at least about two things that go against that reasoning. And the first one is our daily moral practice. In our daily life, we held human beings morally responsible for things that are undesirable, even though they didn't have full control anymore. I can think of a president or a minister who decides to leave his or her position because something that is undesirable happened, even though that minister didn't have control anymore over the things that happened and that were negative. So he or she may leave her position, or we as a population can ask that he or she leaves her or his position. So we hold that human being, that minister or president, for example, we hold that human being responsible, even though there was no control anymore. And second, there's also this thought experimental situation in the sense that, well, assume, for example, that there's a question. Will you share the presentation? Yeah, I'll do that. There's a second thought experimental situation. Assume, for example, that I'm the epileptic patient, and I know that, of course. Well, assume that I can go to a party tonight, Friday evening. There's a birthday party, and I want to go to it, and it's raining. It's sunny in Belgium today, but it's raining. Assume that, and I don't want to get wet, so I decide, being a patient, I decide to take a car, fully aware of the fact that I can be the victim of an epileptic attack within a couple of minutes after deciding, or when I started driving. I step into the car, I start driving, and after 5 minutes of driving, I indeed become the victim of an attack. Lose control over my car, and the consequence is that I hit with my car someone who is riding a bicycle, someone is just walking. Consequence, there's material damage, but there's also physical damage. The other person driving the bicycle needs to go to the hospital. Well, I guess that a lot of people would say that, of course, I should not be punished, but at least I could be held responsible for the negative consequence, the negative effect that happened due to the fact that I was the patient or the victim of an epileptic attack. Yeah. So there are two arguments to say that, well, we hold human beings morally responsible for things that happen, even though there is no full control over that situation. Well, I do believe that this is also the case. I need to go to the next slide. Yeah, next slide. I do believe that this is also the case, and that's my last slide. And this is also the case for autonomous systems, for AI systems. I believe that there is always one human being who can be held responsible for the negative or positive outcome. And the fourth condition, the control condition, is not needed, and the three other conditions can always be fulfilled, can always be met, in the sense that there is always, for example, take an officer who decides to use a killer robot. There is a causal link, and if the officer is autonomous, is deciding upon that autonomously, and second, he or she knows what the positive or negative consequences may be. Yeah. You have to know that the use of a system of an autonomous car can lead to the death of someone driving a bicycle, for example. It is undesirable, but you know that's a foreseen effect, a foreseen negative effect. It's, of course, an unintended effect, but it's a foreseen effect. Well, even though you knew that it could happen, you took the decision. And in other words, you took a risk. And if you decide to take a risk, you can be held responsible for that risk, in the sense that if you believe that the negative outcome is so unwanted, so serious that someone needs to be punished, well, you took a risk, then you can be held responsible for that risk, for that negative outcome. So I believe that in case of AI systems, fully autonomous cars, for example, there is no responsibility gap. So the responsibility gap does not exist in the case of AI systems, and thus is not an argument in favor of the disruption thesis. Next slide. There's a problem with. Oh, okay. My conclusion is, well, there are at least 6 problems moral problems with AI systems, but none of these problems are totally radically new. So none of these problems is an argument in favor of the disruption thesis. Of course, there are very severe problems, but not their nature is not such that they do create or that they are radically new and thus not an argument for the disruption thesis. And if you look at moral responsibility, maybe it's a problem if it exists, maybe it is something that is new, but I think that in the case of AI systems, it doesn't exist. There is no moral responsibility. At the same time, I should be careful to conclude. I should be careful. Maybe there are problems, moral problems that I forgot. Maybe there are some moral issues that are very problematic and also radically new. Or if they don't exist today, maybe they would exist within 10 or 20 years. And that can then maybe be a reason for the disruption thesis, at least at ethical level. But that would be a reason to write another chapter or to write another book. I'm gonna stop here. Thanks for listening. Thanks for attending.
Okay, thanks a lot, Lode, for this very interesting webinar. Everybody is now free to put the questions in the Q&A. We will, for the remaining 8 minutes, address them. At the end, we will give away 3 books, so please stay tuned.
If you would like to have a book, but you were not one of those 3 persons and you would still have a book, you can always send an email to my email address and I'll send it to you.
Yes.
Off the payment, of course, with a small discount.
Yeah, indeed. And the email address is lode.lauwaert@KU Leuven.be. It's in the chat as well. Before I jump into the Q&A, I have basically 2 questions in one, which I really desperate to pose. So it is, first of all, why is it important for companies to pay attention to those 6 problems you mentioned in AI? And also linked to that second, how can those companies, those leaders of tomorrow, embrace moral responsibility today?
Thanks, Matthias. It's a very difficult question. Wait a second, let me think about it. Why is it important? Well, I think it's important to think about moral responsibility or those ethical issues. You not only talk about moral responsibility, but about ethics in general, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So I think it's pretty clear that engineers or AI developers in companies should think about ethics. Well, it's very clear that if you make a technology, if you make an artifact that's going to be used by at least one human being or by groups of human beings or by the entire society, that use or that implementation of the technology can have undesirable effects. And that's at least a reason to think about and to foresee and to prevent those negative effects from happening. Well, that's ethics is about that. And that's the fact that you implement something, that you develop something which can have negative effects is a reason to think about ethics or do some ethics as a company. First and second, what was the second question?
The second was how, in which way can companies embrace that moral responsibility today to make an impact more in the future?
Well, so moral responsibility is about, well, you can be punished or rewarded, and most of the time it's about punishment. You're a candidate for punishment because what you did or what you decided had a negative impact, and it was so impactful that we believe you should be punished. One of the things in order to prevent that you're going to be punished by someone else, by the government, for example, by the legal system, is that you sufficiently use your technical or engineering knowledge. So one of the things about engineering and the technical decisions is that, engineers do have a lot of technical, mathematical, scientific knowledge, and that kind of knowledge is often morally neutral. It's about how things work, how they can be used, etc., etc. But they have to, and that's their role responsibility. They have to use that that scientific knowledge, that morally neutral knowledge, as much as possible. So they have to think about all the things that they have learned when developing, when producing these systems. If they don't do that, if they make something without sufficiently using their scientific knowledge, that could lead to negative, unpleasant, undesirable consequences. So a negative result of the use of a system could be caused by the insufficient use of the scientific knowledge of the engineer. He did know about it, he did know how it worked, but he didn't use that knowledge. And so the negative consequence followed out of the use of that system. Well, that's the reason to punish that engineer. You should have thought about this or that. You should have looked into that scientific theory, to look into that scientific knowledge in order to prevent that negative outcome to exist. And that's a reason to blame someone and to punish. You didn't do enough as an engineer. Well, in order to prevent that punishment, use your knowledge, use your theory, the theoretical framework in order to, when implementing, using, making, inventing, and designing things. So that requirement is purely scientifically, you could say, but it's morally neutral, but can have moral effects, and thus it's morally relevant.
Okay, thanks for your answer, Lode. I have a question from Sai, if I pronounce it correctly. His question is, how is control different from autonomy?
It's a good question. Autonomy means that I'm able to reason independently and based upon enough, I can reason independently, or let's say, I used the interpretation on my slide, autonomy as I'm able to reason independently, and second, I'm able to make a decision based upon that reasoning. That's how I interpreted autonomy on my slide when talking about the three conditions. Well, the fact that I reason independently and I make a decision doesn't necessarily mean that there is control over the system, because the control I'm talking about, I'm interested in when talking about AI systems, refers to the moment, the phase once you decided to use that system. So you can be fully autonomous when thinking about using the system and deciding then to use that system. You push the button, but then there may be no control anymore once you decided to use the system. So the autonomous character of your moral decision can be detached from the phase in which the system is not under control anymore.
Okay, thanks for the answer, Lode. I see it's time. So let's start with giving away 3 books. Let me quickly share my screen. Okay, so yeah, first of all, thanks a lot. The webinar has been recorded, so the recording will be distributed as soon as possible. Like I said, we give away 3 books of We Robots to the people who subscribe to this webinar the fastest and attended. So those persons are Zilal Binici, Juan Munoz, and Thomas Bunyo. So I will reach out to you to get your address information so we can send a copy of We Robots. Anybody else who wants to get a copy of the book of Lode, please drop him an email on lode.lauwaert@kuleuven.be. So yeah, and also follow the Ethical Technology Institute on LinkedIn to be informed about any upcoming webinars. Thanks, Lode, very much for this very interesting talk, and we keep in touch. And thanks the attendees for attending.
Yeah,
have a nice weekend.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Bye bye.